Well, welcome to the Archaeology Institute Weekly Research Seminar. This week we're joined by my colleague, delighted to introduce Dr Julia Cussans. So Julia is a product of the University of Bradford Archaeological Science degree programme, which is a degree programme and a setup that we've really benefited here from the Archaeology Institute in Orkney, in terms of Julia's expertise and her kind of background, but also Professor Ingrid Mainan as well as a kind of a really nice sort of link between Bradford and UHI, and Julia kind of represents that. So with her degree originally at the University of Bradford, and then carrying on to study her PhD doctoral thesis, which was looking at changes in size and shape of domestic mammals in the North Atlantic over time. During the time Julia was spending on that kind of research project, she was also working on a series of archaeological sites from a range of periods around the North Atlantic region. So she was excavating with the North Atlantic Research Unit, which was based at Bradford, Old Scatness Brock, Viking Hunts, the heart of the Atlantic and the Faroe Isles, as well as Brockmouth Iron Age Hill Fort. So building up a real wealth of experience in terms of the multi-period archaeology of the North Atlantic region alongside her PhD research. And then following the completion of her thesis, Julia is one of those amazingly impressive people that manages to walk or move kind of almost seamlessly between the worlds of developer-funded archaeology and academic archaeology. It's always something that people say is kind of one of the great strengths of archaeology, is that we have this relationship with the commercial sector, but it's actually incredibly difficult as an individual researcher to move between those worlds and have the organisation and the kind of timekeeping skills required for the commercial developer-funded world, and then the sort of intellectual headspace for academic work. So Julia is very, very impressive, and she brings those skills and those strengths to UHI archaeology. And so it's kind of, so she was working kind of commercially for units such as Orca, with a brief stint with Orca up in Shetland, and also Archaeological Solutions. But then working freelance as well. So not only working for units, but working freelance within the developer-funded sector. And then now returned in 2021 to academia as a postdoctoral research associate on the Lifty project based at UHI and the Archaeology Institute. So it was great to have Julia here with us, and she's now a kind of fully integrated member of staff whose research is contributing towards the Lifty project, who's also contributing to teaching, and is a real key member of the team here. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Julia to you all for this week's research seminar, and I'll hand over to you, Julia. And I won't do the thing where I say your title just in case you're about to say your title as your opening slide. I'll hand over to Julia.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for that very nice introduction. Yeah, I hope I can live up to some of what you've just said about me. So yeah, this talk is going to look at an awful lot of the stuff I looked at in my PhD, which was actually quite a long time ago now. So the title is pretty much the same as my PhD. So look, changes in the size and shape of domestic mammals across the North Atlantic region over time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I did in my PhD, and then at the end I'm going to sort of try and draw that together a little bit with the work I'm doing at the moment for the Lifty project, and then sort of thinking about how I might kind of carry that forward, because obviously the Lifty project is a finite thing, and I've bought a house in Orkney, so I need to work out how I'm going to stay here and stay active. And now I'm back in North Atlantic academic research, I'm not overly keen to go back into that commercial world, but anyway, here we are. Okay, it's only right. Okay, sorry, minor technical pitch. Okay, so the origins of my PhD came from a long time ago, really, when I was an undergraduate student at University of Bradford. One of the great things about the University of Bradford undergraduate programme was the opportunity to do a year out a year out working, a placement year. And so for part of that placement, I knew I was quite keen on learning about animal bones, and I was very lucky at the time that Terry O'Connor was my personal tutor, although he was just about to leave to go to York and was shortly replaced by Ingrid Mayland, who then became my personal tutor. So, but he had a little bit of an ask around and was like, has anybody got any bone work that Julia could do on her placement? And Julie Bond had previously taken many bone measurements from animal bones from the site of Poole in Orkney on Sunday, and she'd collected lots and lots of measurements but never had any time to do anything with them. And so I was given the task of collating these measurements and processing them and having a look at the measurements to see if we could look at any patterns in size change. And so we looked at patterns in size change in cattle and sheep, and we also tried to see if we could find some wildcats. So it was a really interesting project, and working alongside Terry, some really great guidance. And so that was the first time I looked at bone measuring. I also did some other little animal bone projects with him. And then towards the end of my placement year, I was invited by Steve Dockrell to go and have a dig at Old Scatness, which was probably quite a major turning point in my life, to be fair. And so by the end of my placement year, I had these sort of a little dip into North Atlantic archaeology, into the world of animal bones. And I then went on to do my undergraduate dissertation on an assemblage of animal bones from Old Scatness, and then went back to dig Old Scatness again after I'd finished my undergraduate, and I was then well and truly hooked on the sort of Northern Isles archaeology in the North Atlantic. And eventually this kind of developed into my PhD project, and I was really interested in animal bones, and I was really interested in this, how we could use animal bone measurements to look at changes in species over time, or differences between species at different sites and things. And so that's where the question really developed from. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a little bit my study area. So this was really quite large. We're looking at the kind of the whole of the North Atlantic region. And so I was collecting data from the Western Isles, the Northern Isles, the Faroes, Iceland and Greenland. And I did a lot of the bone measurements. I went around various museums and things myself. But I also collected together lots of published data, and people generously gave me unpublished data. So I was gathering together quite a large database of animal bone measurements, principally from sheep and cattle, just to try and get a little bit of focus in my very wide study area. And I was also looking at all kind of time periods that had domestic mammal bones within them, so really from the Neolithic through to post-medieval. Or I did then, later on in my PhD, kind of focus that down a little, just to get it under control a wee bit. Okay, but during that time as well, I came to the Orkney Museum. It was the first visit I had to Orkney, and I came to Orkney Museum to measure lots of animal bones, and spent a couple of weeks in the stores, which are now somewhere else, but they're not where they were then. But Anne Brundle, who was the curator at the time, was super kind and helped me out a great deal with and looked after me for 2 weeks, and whilst I was staying in a tent in the Pequot Centre. Luckily the weather was quite good. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about first really is, why do domestic mammal bones change in size and shape? And there's lots of reasons, and I think maybe sort of when I started my PhD, I sort of thought, oh, animal bones get bigger and they get smaller, but in fact there's a lot of interacting influences on them, and they don't just change in size, they also change in shape, so in terms of robustness and things as well. And so just to kind of briefly list those things, and I'll look at them a bit more detail in a moment. We've got two main streams. There's the genetic influences, which are things like sexual dimorphism and actual animal breeding. And then there are environmental influences, so we're looking at biogeographical factors, nutrition, the castration of animals, and also the provision of shelter. Okay. First of all, sexual dimorphism. This is probably one of the better known reasons for animals to vary in size and shape as well, to be honest, and in domestic ungulates, so hoofed animals like sheep and cattle, there is really quite marked sexual dimorphism, with the males tending to be larger than the females. But there is variation in this depending on which part of the body you're looking at, and so the parts that are most related to maleness and femaleness show the greatest differences. So you see in horn cores, you get obviously a big difference between males and females in terms of either their presence or absence, and then in their size and conformation, and also things like the pelvis, which obviously has a direct link to the sex of the animal as well, in terms of having baby animals. Okay. So that's one of the genetic influences, and essentially we're looking at males being larger and females being smaller, but it does vary from bone to bone and in how that's expressed. The next major sort of genetic factor is breeding, and this in terms of this is in terms of human influence on animals and selection for desirable characteristics. So it really depends on what characteristics are being selected for. If you are selecting for meat, then you want animals that are going to put on a large amount of meat onto the bone, and that affects also how the bones grow. The other way you might get breeds forming is things where you have, say, the Soay breed, which is more of a kind of a naturally occurring breed just through its genetic isolation from other sheep. Okay, so just to give a bit of a demonstration of how breed can affect skeletal size and shape, here we are looking at a comparison between Mouflon and the Suffolk sheep. Now, Mouflons are pretty much a fairly primitive, unimproved breed of sheep, and the Suffolk is bred for meat. And here the body proportions are scaled so that the height at the shoulder of the animal is the same, and what it shows you is the very sort of quite noticeable difference in the leg length compared to the depth of the body. I don't know, can I do a pointer on here?
So yeah, you go. Yeah.
Is that, yeah, we can see that. So these on the left-hand side of the Mouflon, you can see they just seem to have these much longer legs and a much less depth in the body, whereas the Suffolk sheep's got a much deeper body and these kind of short, sort of stumpier looking legs, and the legs as well, you probably see are much wider and sort of stockier compared to the Mouflon, which is a much more gracile animal. Okay, so these are animals that are bred for increased meat yield. Okay, so next we'll look at the biogeographical factors, and so we're going to go through a number of little of the rules of biogeography here. So the first one we're looking at is Allen's rule, and this is the kind of what they call the proportion rule. You have to excuse my very crude sheep drawings, but and so in what you have here is in colder climates, so my blue sheep on the right hand side is the cold climate sheep, and the warmer climate sheep is the red one on the left. In the cold climates, you get shorter extremities. So the blue sheep has little short legs, whereas the red sheep has much longer legs. And the basic idea around this is that in a colder climate, you need to reduce your body surface area to conserve heat. So and in a warmer climate, you want to increase your surface area to expel heat to keep cool. Okay. So you will get a kind of in the cold climate, the idea is you will get reduced limb length and compared to the warmer climate. The second rule I want to look at is Bergman's rule, and this is what they call the size rule. And again, this is related to reducing the surface area to volume ratio over which heat can be lost. So essentially, in colder climates, it's postulated that not just sheep, animals of a species will be larger in the colder climate than in the warmer climate, in order to reduce that surface area to volume ratio. Okay. And there are a few problems with Bergmann's rule, and that Bergmann discussed that as it was directly linked with temperature, but other researchers have showed what it's more likely related to is aridity. So in the warmer arid climates, you get lower vegetation growth and therefore less available food, and in the cooler wetter climates, you get better growth of pasture and vegetation, and therefore a higher availability of food, and that therefore allows a greater growth of the body. Okay, so it's more likely linked to available food than to temperature. That is the general thought. Now, okay, and this brings us on to Guthrie or Geist's rule, which is the nutrition rule. And this was noted, again, this is sort of related to work done on Bergmann's rule, in that that it was noted that animals increased in size with latitude. So as you got to the higher latitudes, up to around 60 to 65 degrees north, animals were getting bigger, and then when you get past that sort of 60 to 65 degree north tipping point, animals start to get smaller again. In case you haven't worked it out, the strange scribbles on the right hand side are vegetation growth, and so as we're going further north, we're getting greater vegetation growth with those cooler, wetter climates, and then you get this kind of tipping point where the climate is less conducive to vegetation growth. Okay, so Guthrie or Geist rule essentially says that body size is dependent on available nutrition, not temperature, as is stated in Bergmann's rule. So you get this increased nutrition as you go further north. We're only talking in the northern hemisphere here, obviously. As you go further north, and then there's this kind of tipping point around 60 to 65 degrees, where then you start to see a reduction in size again. So, the final of the biogeographical factors I wanted to look at is island dwarfism, and obviously a lot of the sites I was looking at were on islands, and so the basic idea of island dwarfism is that when large mammals colonise islands, they tend to get smaller over time, and this is largely due to a kind of a limitation on the amount of resource available to feed them, and it being much more efficient as a species for you to have more smaller animals than fewer larger ones, and it's a much safer strategy to have more animals that are a little bit smaller than having a few larger animals, and you could only have one or the other supported on a fixed amount of nutrition, if you like. Okay. Or resource on an island. So that moves. I've mentioned nutrition several times now, so we're going to have a look at nutrition next. And so what I want to talk about is how does nutrition, or rather the lack of it, affect growth? And it's not just a straightforward relationship. So here these are some of the lovely pictures I took on my first trip to Orkney, and I was lucky enough to go up to North Royalsay and see the lovely seaweed-eating sheep. And so this is just looking in terms of high and low planes of nutrition. So the figure here is taken from a study from what's his name? Hammond. And here they were looking at planes of nutrition in sheep. So you have on the left-hand side of the diagram is basically looked at planes of nutrition, and they did them on different nutritional regimes. And they were all slaughtered at the same carcass weight. So they were either fed on a what they call high nutritional regime, or a high-low nutritional regime where they were high nutrition and then switched to a low nutrition diet. Then there was a low-high one, so starting on low nutrition and moving up to high nutrition, and then there was also a low nutrition. Okay, and what you can see here is that the high ones are much more robust than the low ones. Sorry, I've just distracted. There was a question popped up on the screen, so that's why I've just lost my concentration a second. So you see the high one is much more robust, and the low one is kind of longer and skinnier and less robust. So when animals have poor nutrition, sort of on a lower nutritional plane than they ideally should be, they tend to grow more slowly, they tend to mature a little later, and they're never able really to attain the proportions of a well-fed animal. And what you can see is also there is a difference as well between the high and the two sort of more variable ones. Probably the closest is the one that had a low and then high nutrition. The one that had high nutrition and then low nutrition is much similar to the low nutrition. So what we can see is the timing of poor nutrition is also important. It's not just whether they had good nutrition or poor nutrition. The actual timing of when that occurred is also important and changes the way an animal grows. And the reason for this is that growth in the mammalian body occurs in a wave. So it basically starts at the extremities, and all you have to do is think about baby calves, baby lambs. When they come out, they've got great big heads and great big feet, and they're all feet and heads. And then as they grow, the other parts of their body become more mature. They sort of grow into their heads and their feet as they get older. So growth starts at the extremities and moves gradually inwards. And this is seen in terms of bone fusion as well. So the very last bones in the body to fuse are the vertebrae, whereas the earlier fusing bones tend to be located more towards the extremities of the body. And the other thing to note here as well is that in terms of the overall body, because obviously the work I was doing was obviously just looking at skeletons. We're only looking at bones, the bits that are left over on the archaeological sites. But the important thing to remember is that the skeleton is an early maturing part of the body, and things like muscle and fat are built up sort of later on. They're much later maturing parts of the body. And so it's really worth remembering that. So and the earlier parts of the body are more preferentially, the early maturing parts of the body are more preferentially sort of fed in terms of when you're on a low plane of nutrition. So the skeleton is fed more preferentially to laying down muscle and certainly fat. Okay, so this is just worth bearing in mind when you're thinking about sites or areas where there might be poor nutrition, and if you're actually starting to see this evidenced in the skeleton, then you have to think about what that means in terms of the actual meat that was available on that animal as well, which is obviously has implications for the people raising these animals. Okay. So next, I just want to have a quick look at castration. This is work by Simon Davis, and the Historic England Sheep Project has also done a lot of work on this recently, looking at how castration and plain nutrition affects the growth of sheep in particular. And what you can hopefully see here, these are looking at various different bone dimensions and comparisons, and they're plotting rams and ewes and wethers. The wethers being the castrated sheep, and it's quite well shown in the kind of bottom left graph. And here you can see that the ewes are the smallest, and then the rams are a little bit bigger, and then the wethers are kind of relatively much longer bone. They have relatively longer bones. and you can also see it a little bit in the astragalus as well, and that the length is a little bit greater in those castrated animals than in the other animals. And the reason for this being that castration delays bone fusion, so the animals are a bit later in maturing, so the bones actually have a longer period of time in which they can grow in length before those ends fuse on and stop that growth. Okay, and this is the other thing that's been found over various studies, is that the timing of that castration will, as with the timing of poor nutrition, will have different effects at different times. So obviously, yes, when the castration happens will depend on which bones are most affected by that castration. Okay, so lastly, I just want to have a quick look at the provision of shelter, and there's been quite a few studies done on this, and essentially if you are expending energy on keeping your body warm, which all warm-blooded animals need to do, then you can't be expending that energy on growth. So in sort of poor climates where you've got high winds and wet weather, animals that aren't provided with any shelter spend an awful lot of energy just on just keeping warm and staying alive, essentially. So the studies have found that provision of shelter will help animals grow bigger, just to be able to grow better, because they're not having to expend energy on keeping warm. So if you can provide a roof and walls, then that's the best thing. The next best is walls, and then the third best is just a roof. So yes, walls really help in just cutting out that wind. And you can see the animal, the sheep here, sheltering behind the wall and keeping out the wind, probably. Okay. So there's just a quick reminder of the study area, and I will just go for the next few slides, just look at they just highlight the different sites that I had a look at in my PhD, so it's just going down around the different areas. So this is the Western Isles, and there's a number of sites down that western coast there where I gathered published and unpublished data sets. And just to note here as well, it's probably already mentioned that the data came from sites of a range of dates, and obviously a range of locations, and a range of site status as well. So here's the Northern Isles, so Orkney and Shetland. So quite a lot of sites in Orkney, not that many in Shetland. That's largely to do with bone preservation and the availability of data a lot of the time. There's just one site we gathered from the Faroe Islands. Just that there's not been a huge amount of work done there thus far, although that's probably changed a lot since I did my PhD. Then sites gathered in Iceland, and then the two areas of Greenland. So this is the eastern settlement, which is the more southerly of the two settlements, and then the western settlement, which is further north in Greenland, confusingly. Okay, so those are the sites I gathered data from, and then in order to kind of get a bit of a sort of try and tame some of my data a little bit and work out how to deal with all this, and to how to bring together all these different factors that influence the growth of bones, and to bring together all the data, I formed a series of hypotheses, and I'm not going to look at all of these ones today, we'll just look at some of them. So I had a latitude hypothesis, and this was that animal size would decrease with increasing latitude above 60 degrees north due to decreased vegetation productivity. And for this hypothesis, I only looked at the Viking and Norse period sites, because those were the ones I had in that kind of over 60 degree north area. Then I had a status hypothesis, so the higher status sites would have larger animals than lower status sites due to a greater access to resources at the higher status sites. So I thought it would seem likely a lot of the higher status sites would have more control over areas of land, have greater areas of land available to them, and therefore they would be able to grow their animals bigger because they would have more nutrition available. There's the agricultural intensification hypothesis, which I'm not going to go into in any detail today, but just to run over what that is, that's so increases in agricultural production, in particular the introduction of oats in the later Iron Age in the Northern and Western Isles would lead to size increases in domestic stock. So again, that's to do with the available nutrition. So if they are able to provide better nutrition for their animals, then the animals, in theory, would be bigger. Okay, but I'm not going to look at that one today, just to kind of minimise the time and allow me to go and talk a little bit about Lifty at the end as well. And then there's the environmental degradation hypothesis. So environmental degradation in Greenland, due to the onset of the Little Ice Age, would cause a decrease in livestock size towards the end of the Norse occupation. So those were my hypotheses that I formed, and then I had a look at my data in relation to those. So first of all, the latitude hypothesis, and within my PhD there are many graphs and tables and a great deal of data, so I've just kind of cherry-picked a few bits here to talk about. So this isn't the whole data set by any means. So this looks at mean sheep astragalus length plotted against latitude for sites of the Norse period. So we can see there's sites from Orkney, Shetland, the eastern settlements in Greenland, the western settlement in Greenland, and Iceland. And what we're supposed to see, or what the hypothesis suggested, was that we should see a negative correlation. So the trend line should be sloping in the opposite direction if my hypothesis was to be correct. Now, what I did here, the site in Iceland, there's just one site in Iceland that was included in this study, and that's the site of Gausier, which is a trading site, and therefore it is highly likely that the sheep at said trading site were not brought up in that area, and that could well have been brought in from outside. And in fact, if you exclude that site from there, then you do get a very slight negative trend, but it is extremely slight there. Okay, so yeah, very slight negative correlation. Okay, so looking at, this is a different set. This is metacarpal shaft diaphysis, diaphysis breadth. So it's what we call the smallest breadth of the diaphysis. So the bone shaft, the bit in the middle where it's the narrowest. So this is a breadth measurement, and again here you're seeing, certainly not seeing a negative correlation. You're seeing almost no correlation whatsoever there. So again, very little change with latitude there. And then the final graph on this, again, this is looking at tibia, radius proximal breadth measurement. So again, it's breadth measurement, and these are both a box and whisker plot looking again at the settlements in terms of their latitude, and again we're seeing very little difference in those sites, and seeing very little change. Okay. Finally, I just wanted to look at Greenland, and here the data were very sparse, so I've kind of bunched the data together. I'm not sure that's a technical term, but here this is just looking at the west settlement versus the eastern settlement, looking at sheep measurements and just the means, and where we were finding the smallest means for any particular dimension, and where we were finding the largest means. And that does tend to indicate that in the western settlement, which is the one further north, that's around 64 degrees north, has more smaller bones than the one at the eastern settlement. Okay, so this is slightly indicating that at least in Greenland there may be some evidence of this latitude hypothesis bearing out. Okay, so you're getting some evidence of a decrease in size with increased latitude. in Greenland. But it doesn't seem to bear out across the rest of that North Atlantic region. Okay, and there could be a lot of reasons for this. There are a lot of other factors other than latitude affecting these sites that we're looking at. One of the major ones is the ameliorating effect of the Gulf Stream, particularly on Orkney and Shetland. And another one is we're looking at the island, the sizes of the islands we're looking at is quite variable. So the ones in the Orkney, Shetland, Faroes are all fairly small islands with much sort of more limited resource, whereas Iceland is obviously a much larger island, and Greenland is a massive island but has very limited resource. So there's a lot of different things going on there. The other thing, if you remember, when we were talking about this, the Geith rule, they were talking at a tipping point around 60 to 65 degrees north, and which is pretty much exactly where we are. So we're perhaps just seeing a levelling out there and seeing just less of a change. Okay. So I just want to move on a little to talk about status. So this is looking at a couple of sites in the Western Isles. So Dunvulen is a Broch site and Neep is a wheelhouse site, and the Broch site essentially being a higher status site than the wheelhouse site. Now, if you remember my excuse me, my status hypothesis was that higher status sites would tend to have larger animals than lower status sites, because they should have a greater available resource. And this is just one example, but it bore out across other examples in the Western Isles. And you can see that these are log ratio calculations from a variety of different sheep bone measurements. And that log ratio allows you to look at different dimensions on the same scale, so you are essentially comparing your measurement to a known standard and saying whether your measurement is bigger or larger than that known standard and to what degree. So the known standard is essentially at 0, and then the animals, the bones that we're looking at are spread either side of that. So what we can see here is that the spread of measurements from Dunvulen and Neep is very, very much overlapping, and the little red arrows pointing down there show the mean values from Dunvulen and Neep, and show that the mean value for Dunvulen is in fact smaller than the mean value for Neep, which is the opposite of what we would be expecting to see. Okay. Okay, so we'll just have another look at a few of the Greenland sites. Okay, so again here we're looking at sheep goat bones from the Western settlement in Greenland. So when we're talking about latitude, that shouldn't be a particular factor. So we are hopefully just looking at different status sites. So at V51, which is Sandnes, which is a high status site, and then V48 and V35, which are both low status sites. And again, this is the log ratio values, and again we can see there's a huge amount of overlap, and in fact the one with the highest mean is V48, which is one of the low status sites, and the high status site V51 has got a very similar mean to V35 and a lower mean than V48. So again, it does not appear that the high status sites are growing larger animals. Okay, and one of the possible thoughts for this is that I think it was generally thought or known that the area available to V51, the high status site, they had a much larger area of pasture available to them, but possibly what they were doing was actually just filling it with far more animals, and therefore you were getting a lot of, even though you had a large area, that you were actually filling it with a huge number of animals, and therefore they weren't getting the sort of benefit of that extra pasture, if you like. It does also, the intriguing thing as well is just if we look down at the bottom end of the high status, we've got this really tiny little animal down here. And I think at the time I did wonder whether there was, I think there's a thought that animals are being given in terms of sort of taxes or payments to the high status site, and that maybe if you were one of these low status sites and you had to give a sheep to your landlord, that perhaps you wouldn't give them the best sheep you had, you might give them just the feeblest, littlest sheep you had. But yeah, so that was just another thought I had on that at the time. So finally, I want to have a look at the degradation hypothesis before I move on and talk a little bit about Lifty as well. So this is looking at sheep and goat astragalus dimensions. This is from a site called Garden und Sandet, or Goose, in Western Settlement of Greenland. And here we're seeing, let me just think, what we've got. The sheep are the solid lines, and the goats are the dotted lines, and then the various colours relate to different measurements of the astragalus. And what we can see is the sheep and the goats do different things, which is quite interesting. But the sheep bones seem to get increase in size between phase 1 and phase 2, and then decrease again in size in phase 3. And we'll look at this a little more in the next graph as well. But it is interesting to see that the goats are doing something slightly different. So here are my thoughts on the sheep astragalus. So these are some of the same data, but plotted in a scatter plot. And so the dark blue are the phase 1, and the pink are the phase 2, and then the yellows are the phase 3. So I was wondering if between phase 1 and phase 2 you're getting improved nutrition, things are quite good, the pasture is probably going quite well, all things are going nicely in Greenland, and then in phase 3 things start to go a bit bad in Greenland, and that there's that possibly with the cooling climate you were getting a reduction in the size of the bones, and just a reduction in the availability of nutrition. And what many of you may know is that in Greenland, the Norse settlement there eventually died out and became non-viable. So it didn't continue. You don't get these sort of long multi-period sites like you find in the Northern Isles and Western Isles and in Iceland. So yeah, things got particularly very, very bad towards the end, and they simply weren't able to support themselves. And this is particularly interesting in terms of what I was saying earlier on, where you have, in terms of skeletal growth, being preferentially treated over muscle and fat growth. So if your animals are really reducing in skeletal growth, then they're probably going to be very skinny and emaciated, and they're not going to be much good to eat. They don't provide much high energy food for the human population. Okay. So just to flip through a couple more of these, this is just to show that the goats are again doing something different. I've never figured out why that was, but it is interesting. And here again, this is looking at tibia, so different bone measurements, and this is in the eastern settlement of Greenland. And again, you've got this kind of dipping down in the size in the later part of the settlement. So this is. These were done on the depth below ground surface, so the latest material being from the highest part of the midden, and you see they're sort of gradually dipping down in their size there and reducing in size. Okay, so just a quick summary of my PhD work. So lots of interacting factors affecting size and shape of the domestic mammals. And really important to think about the human consequences of that. So if you're getting reduced bone size, that indicates an even greater reduction in fat and muscle, and vice versa. If you're seeing big and chunky animals, then the amount of one of the reasons they might be big and chunky is that they have to support a big weight of muscle and fat. There's often a preference for more small animals over fewer larger animals, and that's a good risk management strategy. And and that fodder production has an influence on livestock and dairy production, which is not something I've really touched on today, but that was part of my PhD. So where am I at now? Well, I'm now in Orkney working on the LIFTY project. LIFTY is looking in from the edge, and it looks at the impact of international commercialisation on Northwest Europe's peripheral communities from 1468 to 1712. So we're looking at production, commerce and consumption in Orkney and Shetland. So this is a project run partly out of the UHI, there are several people here working on the project, but also from the University of Tübingen and the Museum of Bremerhaven in, it's the, the German Maritime Museum, and also from the University of Lincoln. So it's quite a big team of people working on lots of different aspects, looking at trade and exchange in Orkney and Shetland, and it's quite closely related, looking at Hanseatic trade, but also other forms of trade as well. And the lovely picture, aerial shot here, is of Scale Farm on Mersey, which is one of our case study sites. So there's an awful lot going on with this project. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I'm just trying to link in where I'm going with the kind of relating to domestic mammal biometry. So one of the things we noticed, this is a graph of frequencies of domestic mammals in Orkney and Shetland over time. And one of the things you can see from this is you've got cattle at the bottom, sheep at the green, pigs are purple, and here horses are this pale blue. And what we can see is around 1400 you get quite a significant increase in the number of horse bones being found at archaeological sites. Okay, which is quite, they are present all the way along. There's little bits of horse all the way along, but then all of a sudden they become really, really popular. So one of the other things you start in terms of anecdotal evidence in Orkney, they apparently aren't bothered about breeding their own horses. I don't know this for a fact, but there is some evidence to suggest that they are bringing them in from outside, from Shetland, and maybe from Caithness as well. We're starting to wonder whether this increase in these horses at this time is related to an increase in trade, and the fact that if you are on a farm producing beer barley or butter or what have you that is to be traded, then you need to get that from your farm to a central place for distribution, and horses are really handy for doing that sort of thing. So that is a little thought on that. And we have a student at the moment, Amy Blank, who is looking at some of the horse bones from Scale, our case study site. And particularly we got excited by this horse's head that you can see has been nicely, if I could get that, decapitated, and it was placed quite purposefully in the rubble of a building, so and not just dumped but quite carefully placed there. And there are a number of other horse bones as well, so we're looking at doing some horse bone measurements and just trying to study these horses and find out a little bit more, looking for more evidence of butchery. And we've also got some radiocarbon dates and a little bit of stable isotope data that has come with those radiocarbon dates as well. So we're just in the process of having a look at those, and so here we have a little bit of information about horse movement. This is from Shetland ponies from Shetland. Oh gosh, you can't see it at all. Sorry, it shows up. Hopefully, it's showing up clear on people's screens at home. I will attempt to read it, but it was written in 1640. So it's essentially, to translate it, I can't read it in the original way, but it's 6 Shetland nags sent to Orkney with Hugh Denison upon the Baron of Burgess boat to be delivered to Patrick Smith of Bracco of the ages, colours and marks as follows. And that was the 12th of August 1640, and there is then a list of 6 horses, and it gives their ages and what they look like, and yes, it's written in olive old-fashioned language that I cannot fully translate. But what it does show is that there is evidence that horses were moving around. They weren't just being bred in place, and they were being moved around. And so I'm quite interested in the future in having a really good look at all these horses. Why are they increasing in number? How are they being moved around? And what's the reason for them being moved around? Why, are people in Orkney breeding horses, or are they just buying them in from outside? And what's going on with that? So, almost at the end. So just some potential future projects, looking at integrating so we could look at the biometry, which obviously I'm interested in. It'd be really good to integrate some of that with stable isotope data, possibly tooth microwear, which is Ingrid's, one of her specialities. It'd be good to look at kind of nutritional stress indicators, as well as the bone size, and looking at the kind of the more standard or basic zooarchaeological data. So it'd be really interesting to look at how, I've put equid because it's not necessarily just thought it'd be horses, ponies, there may be other things, mules, donkeys, moving around, their breeding, husbandry, and particularly in this kind of medieval or late medieval and post-medieval Scotland, where they really seem to be, horses are becoming really exciting. And I've just put in this, which seems completely random given what I've just talked about, but a lot of my commercial work in the past has been on Roman things, and when I was working at Oscar, we started to see some little hints of Roman style butchery in the cattle butchery. So I think it'd be a really interesting avenue to go down to have a look at were there any Roman influences this far north in terms of animal husbandry, butchery, etc. I think that's it. That's lots of people to say thank you to from PhD and current work. And thank you very much for listening.
Just jump back up here. Thank you. Raggy, have you got questions? We've got a bit of time for questions now. Have you been monitoring questions in the chat? Is there stuff that's coming from members of the audience?
I didn't think Julia could see the questions from where she was, but apparently she could, and it was distracting. So we got one question, and then people stopped asking because it was distracting. So the question that we have is from Dave. He says, the rules, such as Bergman's or Guthrie's rules, seem to be based on herbivores primarily. Do they hold true for omnivores and carnivores, e.g. pigs, dogs, or cats as well?
Good question. I don't know. That's my short answer is I'm not sure. I think yes. I think in terms there is certainly evidence. Some of the people who were studying them they weren't just looking at herbivores. They were looking at things like bears and wolves and things as well, and they did seem to hold true for those. And I think what you're probably looking at, that the sort of primary factor is vegetation growth, but then that feeds you're looking at sort of food chains, and if you're growing your herbivores bigger, then you can probably grow your carnivores bigger as well, and that they would that increased nutrition would pass down along the chain. So yes, I believe it does work for them as well, and some of the experimental work was done on things like pigs in terms of level of nutrition, and they came up with the same answers.
Thank you. So anybody else who is logged in remotely and would like to ask a question, you can put them in the chat and I'll put them over to Julia. But meanwhile, while people type, we could maybe see if there's questions in the room.
What's the difference between sort of those differences you noticed in Roman butchery? What's sort of kind of like the identifying things?
Oh, okay, yes. Roman butchery, particularly on military and urban sites, not so much on the rural sites, but there are certain things they do that are very specific, and they're very specifically Roman. One of those is the way they treat scapulae, so the shoulder blade, cattle scapulae most particularly, and there's some very distinct chopping they do around the head of the scapula, around the articulation. There's some really distinct chopping, and then what you also tend to find often is evidence for a hole in the blade, which is thought to be where they've been hooked and hung up. And we found a beautiful example of one of these at Old Scatness, and all beautifully intact with the hole in it. And we did send a bit of it for radiocarbon dating, and off the top of my head, I have no idea what the date was. But yeah, it was, yes, it's a really, really distinctively Roman thing to do with the cattle scapula. I have a feeling that maybe the one we had at Scatness was not just the scapula. I think it could have been articulated with the rest of the. I could be wrong, but that's my memory from many, many years ago, and that they could, that they're hanging joints of meat through the scapula. That's easy to get a hook through, but provides a bit of strength.
That's very good. That's very cool.
Any more questions on the chat, Raggy?
Yes, Jerry Bigelow has one. He says, a very interesting presentation. I think the Greenland case may include some noise because of factors like absolute reliance on stored fodder over the winter for all animals. There are all animals there and a very short grazing season. Also, when comparing trends between small brackets poor and very large brackets wealthy farms, there could have been a non-proportional distribution of fodder resources relating to food preferences. Maybe there are some inter-regional differences based on intersecting factors in your hypothesis.
Yes, that does seem very likely. I'm not sure. Was there a question? That seemed like a comment more than a question, I think.
Yeah, maybe it was a suggestion more than a question.
Yeah, no, but that does seem very sensible. Yes, yeah. Thank you, Jamie.
And then Dave is back with another. Some of the Greenland data may reflect the drought hypothesis recently submitted during the Norse period.
So may reflect the what hypothesis?
Like it dry instead of
drought.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I might like to ask a question, Raggy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, sideways question. I was just wondering, with drawing material from such a wide range of different contexts and different places, did you get a sense of animal remains being treated differently in different countries, in different kind of curatorial contexts, the way in which people excavate animal remains, the way in which material has been sampled, and the way in which it's been studied within museum collections? Was that because it's such a diverse group of collections that you were working with, and such data that's come from all sorts of different sources? I just wondered if you got a feeling of archaeologists around the North Atlantic thinking about and treating animal remains differently across the region, or is it fairly uniform?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's quite a good one. To be fair, in terms of me measuring bones, I came to Orkney and I also went to Denmark to measure some of the Greenland material. So the Zoology Museum in Copenhagen. I wasn't going to the other place. I wasn't going to anywhere in Iceland, or I suppose the Iceland ones would be largely with Tom McGovern's team. But what I was being given was data sheets of animal bone measurements. So yes, there was quite a difference, I guess, between the fancy Zoology Museum in Copenhagen and the less fancy Orkney Museum, and that it was the Zoology Museum is very big, and so they had this like amazing climate control stores, and they'd had all these fantastic collections there, and obviously Orkney Museum is also fantastic, but the facilities aren't. They're not the same for the facilities. So, and that's not through a lack of desire to have them. That is just two different institutions and what they have available to them. But yeah, I couldn't really comment on the other places. But interesting question.
Brilliant, thank you. There's no more questions in the chat, so thanks a lot from everybody who's been logged in from different places.
Thank
I
you
want
very
to
much.
say before,
So,
yeah, big applause. Before you go, everyone, I would like to mention that the next seminar is already in 3 weeks. We're having it a week early because our speaker is from across the Atlantic. So we're trying to avoid clashing with Thanksgiving. So the next seminar is on the 18th of November already, and it'll be at 7 p.m. GMT. So hopefully see you guys then as well. And thank you so much, Julia. That was super interesting.
Thank you for having me.